The morning mist hung heavy over Windsor Castle as Charles walked slowly through the East Terrace garden, his footsteps echoing against the ancient stone pathways. The weight of the crown, both literal and metaphorical, had never felt heavier than it did in these quiet moments before dawn. 3 months had passed since his beloved mother's funeral, yet the grief still struck him in unexpected waves, particularly here among her favorite roses. Elizabeth had been more than a mother to him, she had been his guide, his compass, and his greatest teacher. Every decision he made as king was filtered through the lens of what she might have done, what she might have advised. The transition from prince to king had been decades in the making, yet nothing could have prepared him for the complexity of emotions that came with finally wearing the crown that had adorned her head for 70 years. As he rounded the corner toward the private apartments, Charles noticed unusual activity near the Queen's former study. Boxes were being moved, and he could hear voices coming from within the room that had remained largely untouched since Elizabeth's passing. His step quickened, a frown creasing his brow. He had given explicit instructions that his mother's personal belongings were to be handled with the utmost care and reverence, and only after the family had time to properly grieve and decide together what should be done with her most precious possessions. Through the partially open door, he could see Camilla directing several staff members as they carefully wrapped items in tissue paper. His wife's voice carried a tone of authority that made him pause. She was pointing to various objects around the room, speaking in hushed but decisive tones about which items should go where. Charles felt a knot forming in his stomach as he stepped closer, trying to understand what was happening. "Those jewelry boxes need special handling," Camilla was saying to one of the footmen. "And make sure the photographs are properly protected. These will be going to my estate in Wiltshire." Her words hit Charles like a physical blow. He stood frozen in the doorway, watching as his wife supervised the packing of his mother's most personal treasures. The study had always been Elizabeth's sanctuary. It was here that she had conducted her most private correspondence, where she had kept the gifts from her children and grandchildren, where photographs of family moments lined the shelves alongside first editions of her favorite books. The room still held the faint scent of her lavender perfume, and Charles had found comfort in simply sitting here occasionally, feeling her presence in the familiar surroundings. Now, watching boxes being filled with these intimate mementos, Charles felt a surge of emotion that combined grief, confusion, and growing anger. He cleared his throat, announcing his presence. The activity in the room immediately stopped, and all eyes turned to him. Camilla straightened, her expression shifting from confident direction to something more guarded. "Charles," she said, her voice taking on a lighter tone. "You're up early this morning." She moved toward him, but he remained rigid in the doorway, his gaze moving from the boxes to the partially emptied shelves to the staff members who suddenly seemed very interested in examining their shoes. "What is happening here?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an underlying tension that everyone in the room could feel. "Why are my mother's belongings being packed?" Camilla's hand touched his arm gently, a gesture that would normally comfort him but now felt presumptuous. "Darling, we discussed this. The estate needs to be settled, and there are certain items that would be more appropriate in a family setting rather than remaining in the official royal residence. I was simply organizing things to make the transition easier." But Charles didn't remember any such discussion. His mind raced back through recent conversations, trying to recall when they might have talked about moving his mother's possessions. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that no such conversation had taken place. His jaw tightened as he looked around the room again, noting which items were being packed. Among the items heading for boxes were some of Elizabeth's most personal treasures, a collection of letters from his father, Prince Philip, written during their courtship, photographs from private family holidays that had never been made public, jewelry that had belonged to his grandmother, Queen Mary, and great-grandmother, Queen Alexandra. These weren't just valuable items, they were the threads that wove together the tapestry of his family's history. "I don't recall having this discussion," Charles said slowly, each word measured. "And I'm quite certain I would have remembered authorizing the removal of my mother's personal effects." His tone had shifted now, taking on the authority of a king who was not pleased with what he was discovering. The staff members in the room exchanged uncomfortable glances. They had been following what they believed were proper instructions, but the tension in the air made it clear that something was very wrong. Charles noticed their discomfort and addressed them directly. "Please stop what you're doing and leave us," he said, his voice kind but firm. "We'll sort this out." The footmen and housekeepers quickly filed out, leaving Charles and Camilla alone in the half-packed study. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations and growing understanding. Camilla's confident demeanor began to crack slightly as she realized that Charles was not simply asking for clarification, he was questioning her authority to make these decisions at all. "The children need to have something of their grandmother," Camilla said, her voice taking on a defensive tone. "Tom and Laura have so few memories of family history, and I thought some of these pieces would help them feel more connected to the royal heritage." Charles felt his composure beginning to fray. Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopez were Camilla's children from her first marriage, and, while he had grown fond of them over the years, the idea that they had a claim to his mother's most personal possessions struck him as presumptuous beyond belief. "These items belong to the crown," Charles said, his voice rising slightly despite his efforts to remain calm. "They are part of the royal collection, and decisions about their disposition need to be made by the family as a whole, not unilaterally by any one person." Camilla's face flushed, and, for the first time since he'd known her, Charles saw something in her expression that he didn't recognize, a hardness, a calculation that made him question whether he truly knew the woman he had married. "I am your wife," she said, her own voice taking on an edge. "I am the queen consort. These decisions are well within my purview to make." Her words hung in the air between them, a claim to authority that Charles found both shocking and infuriating. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed to illuminate the growing chasm between them. Charles realized that this moment was about much more than boxes and belongings. It was about power, about respect, about the very foundation of their relationship and his role as king. As he looked around the study one more time, taking in the disruption to his mother's carefully maintained space, Charles felt something fundamental shift inside him. The grief that had been his constant companion since Elizabeth's death was now joined by a new emotion, doubt about the woman standing before him, and growing certainty that this conversation was far from over. The boxes sat half-packed, like a pause in a symphony that had taken a dark and unexpected turn. Charles knew that the decisions he made in the coming hours would ripple through not just his marriage, but through the very institution he had sworn to protect and preserve. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of Charles's private office as he sat behind the mahogany desk that had once belonged to his great-great-grandfather, King George V. The events of the morning had left him shaken, not just by what he had discovered, but by the implications of what it might mean. He had spent the last several hours in meetings with his private secretary and the keeper of the privy purse, trying to understand exactly what had been happening with his mother's estate. What he learned disturbed him more than he could have imagined. Sir Michael Stevens, the keeper of the privy purse, sat across from him with a thick folder of documents, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain. "Your Majesty," he began carefully, "I'm afraid the situation is more complex than we initially realized. Over the past 6 weeks, we've received multiple requests for the transfer of various items from the late Queen's personal collection." Charles felt his heart sink. "Multiple requests?" "Yes, sir. All bearing what appeared to be proper authorization. Items ranging from jewelry to artwork to personal correspondence have been systematically catalogued for removal." Sir Michael opened the folder and withdrew several official-looking documents. The requests were quite specific and seemed to follow proper protocol. As Charles examined the papers, his trained eye immediately noticed discrepancies. While the letterhead was correct and the language appropriately formal, certain elements didn't align with standard royal household procedures. More troubling still was the pattern of items being requested. They weren't random selections, but rather carefully chosen pieces that represented the most historically significant and personally meaningful of his mother's possessions. "Who authorized these transfers?" Charles asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Sir Michael shifted uncomfortably. "The authorizations bore the seal of the Queen Consort's office, sir. Given her position in the household, the staff assumed they were legitimate requests that had been discussed and approved at the appropriate level." The weight of understanding settled heavily on Charles's shoulders. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding or an overzealous attempt to help with estate management. This was a systematic effort to claim pieces of royal heritage for personal use, conducted with enough official appearance to avoid immediate scrutiny. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Princess Anne entered, her expression grim. Charles's sister had always been direct and practical, qualities that had served the royal family well during difficult times, but the look on her face suggested that the situation was about to become even more complicated. "Charles, we need to talk," Anne said without preamble. "Edward and I have been comparing notes, and there are some things you need to know." Prince Edward arrived shortly after, carrying a leather portfolio that he placed on Charles's desk with obvious reluctance. "We've been conducting our own investigation," Edward explained. After Anne mentioned some irregularities she'd noticed when visiting Mother's apartments last week, we decided to dig deeper. Anne opened Edward's portfolio and withdrew a series of photographs. These were taken last month, she said, spreading them across the desk. Look carefully at what's documented here versus what should be in Mother's private collection. Charles studied the photographs with growing alarm. They showed display cases and shelves that should have contained specific items, pieces he remembered from childhood, gifts from foreign dignitaries, family heirlooms that had been passed down through generations. Comparing these images to his own memories of his mother's rooms, he could see that numerous valuable and historically significant pieces were missing. How long has this been going on? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. That's what we're trying to determine, Edward replied. But, based on what we've been able to piece together, it appears that items have been disappearing gradually over the past 2 months. The process was subtle enough that individual staff members didn't notice, but, when you look at the overall picture. And picked up a particularly damning photograph. This display case contained the Boucheron sapphire suite that was a wedding gift from the French president in 1953. It's been in Mother's personal collection for 70 years. According to the documentation we found, it was transferred to private family custody 3 weeks ago. Charles felt a chill run through him. The sapphire suite wasn't just valuable, it was historically significant and held deep sentimental meaning for his mother. She had worn pieces from it at several important state occasions, and it had been featured in official royal portraits. The idea that it had been removed from the royal collection without his knowledge was both shocking and heartbreaking. There's more, Edward said grimly. He withdrew another document from the portfolio. We found this in the Queen Consort's office files. It appears to be a comprehensive inventory of items earmarked for removal. The document was extensive, running to several pages and listing hundreds of items from Elizabeth's personal collection. Each entry included detailed descriptions, estimated values, and proposed destinations. As Charles read through the list, his amazement turned to horror. The inventory wasn't just focused on valuable items, it included deeply personal mementos that had no significant monetary worth but held immense sentimental value. Among the listed items were letters from his father during their courtship, a set of first edition books that had belonged to his grandfather King George VI, photographs from private family moments that had never been made public, and even some of the late Queen's personal journals. The thought that these irreplaceable pieces of family history were being treated as transferable assets made Charles feel physically ill. Look at the destinations, Anne said, pointing to a column on the right side of each page. Most of these items are designated for the Parker Bowles family estate or for private collection of Queen Consort family members. The implications hit Charles like a thunderbolt. This wasn't about preserving royal heritage or ensuring proper estate management. This was about claiming valuable and historically significant pieces for personal benefit, using the authority of royal position to legitimize what amounted to the appropriation of crown property. Edward leaned forward in his chair. Charles, there's something else. We've discovered that some items have already been moved. A few pieces have been spotted at public events, charity auctions, private exhibitions, being presented as part of the Parker Bowles family collection. The room fell silent as the full scope of the situation became clear. Charles felt a combination of betrayal, anger, and profound sadness washing over him. The woman he had married, whom he had trusted with the most intimate aspects of royal life, had been systematically removing pieces of their family's heritage for her own family's benefit. As if summoned by their conversation, Camilla appeared in the doorway. Her timing seemed almost too convenient, and Charles wondered if she had been monitoring their meeting. Her expression showed a mixture of defiance and concern as she took in the serious faces around the desk and the documents spread across its surface. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important, she said, her tone carefully neutral. But Charles could see the calculation in her eyes as she tried to assess how much they had discovered. The siblings exchanged glances. Anne's expression had hardened to something approaching contempt, while Edward looked deeply uncomfortable with the entire situation. Charles realized that this confrontation, which he had been dreading, could no longer be avoided. Actually, Camilla, Charles said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart, your timing is perfect. We were just discussing some irregularities in the management of my mother's estate. Perhaps you could help clarify a few things for us. The challenge in his voice was unmistakable, and Camilla's carefully composed facade began to show cracks. She stepped further into the room, but Charles noticed that she remained near the door, as if calculating whether a quick retreat might become necessary. The afternoon light continued to fade outside, casting the room in increasingly dramatic shadows that seemed to mirror the dark turn their family relationships had taken. Charles knew that whatever happened in the next few minutes would fundamentally change not just his marriage, but the entire structure of the royal household moving forward. The tension in the room was so thick it seemed to press against the ornate wallpaper of Charles's private office. Camilla stood near the doorway, her usual confidence replaced by something more guarded as she assessed the serious expressions of the three siblings. The documents spread across Charles's desk seemed to glow in the lamplight, evidence of a betrayal that cut deeper than any political scandal or public controversy the royal family had ever faced. "Please, sit down, Camilla," Charles said, his voice carrying the measured tone he had learned from years of diplomatic meetings. But, beneath the surface politeness, those who knew him well could detect the steel that had been forged through decades of preparation for kingship. Camilla moved to the chair across from the desk, but Charles noticed she sat on its edge, ready to spring up at a moment's notice. Her eyes darted across the documents, and he could see her mind working rapidly, trying to assess exactly what they had discovered and how she might respond. And was the first to speak, her voice cutting through the heavy silence with characteristic directness. "Camilla, we need to discuss some items that appear to have gone missing from our mother's personal collection. Items that, according to household records, were authorized for removal by your office." "Missing?" Camilla's voice carried a note of surprise that Charles might have believed genuine if he hadn't seen the inventory with his own eyes. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I've been helping to organize Elizabeth's belongings, yes, but only to ensure they're properly preserved and cared for." Edward leaned forward, his diplomatic training evident in his careful phrasing. "The issue isn't the organization, Camilla. It's the destination of certain pieces. Some very significant items appear to have been transferred to locations outside the royal collection." Charles watched his wife's face carefully as Edward spoke. He had known Camilla for decades, had been through triumph and scandal with her, and had learned to read the subtle signs of her emotional state. What he saw now was something he had never witnessed before, a cold calculation that seemed to regard his family's heritage as nothing more than assets to be redistributed. "I think there may be some misunderstanding," Camilla said, but her voice lacked its usual warmth. "As Queen Consort, I have certain responsibilities regarding the management of royal household assets. Everything I've done has been within my proper authority." The claim hung in the air like a challenge. Charles felt something inside him crystallize into certainty. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an overzealous interpretation of her role. This was a deliberate appropriation of family treasures, conducted with enough official veneer to provide plausible deniability. "Show her the inventory," and said bluntly, never one to avoid difficult confrontations. Charles slid the multi-page document across the desk. As Camilla's eyes moved down the list, her composure began to crack visibly. The comprehensive nature of the inventory made it impossible to claim ignorance or misunderstanding. This was clearly a systematic plan to relocate significant portions of the late Queen's personal collection. "The Boucheron sapphires," Charles said quietly, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Those were wedding gifts to my mother. They've been part of the royal collection for 70 years. Yet according to this inventory, they've been transferred to private family custody." Camilla's hands trembled slightly as she held the papers. "Charles, you have to understand. Tom and Laura have grown up feeling disconnected from royal heritage. I thought that having some meaningful pieces would help them feel more included in the family legacy." The explanation only deepened Charles's sense of betrayal. "These items aren't party favors to be distributed, Camilla. They're part of the historical record of the monarchy. They belong to the institution, not to any individual family member." "I am your wife." Camilla's voice rose for the first time, her careful composure finally breaking. "I am the Queen Consort. My children are part of this family now, and they deserve to share in its heritage." The outburst revealed more than Camilla probably intended. Charles could see now that this wasn't about preserving family history or ensuring proper care of treasured items. This was about claiming legitimacy and status for her own bloodline, using royal treasures as symbols of acceptance and belonging. Anne's response was swift and cutting. "Your children are not royal, Camilla. They're welcome as part of our extended family, but they have no claim to crown property or royal heritage. What you're describing isn't inclusion, it's appropriation." Edward tried to maintain diplomatic balance. "Perhaps we can find a way to address everyone's concerns while still preserving the integrity of the royal collection." There may be appropriate ways to know, Charles interrupted, his voice carrying absolute finality. There is no compromise here. These items were not ours to give away. They belong to the crown, to the institution, to future generations of the royal family. What's been done here is... He struggled to find words that conveyed the depth of his disappointment. It's theft. The word hit the room like a physical blow. Camilla recoiled as if she'd been slapped, her face going pale. How dare you? I have devoted my life to supporting you and this institution. By stealing from it? And interjected sharply. By systematically removing historical artifacts for your own family's benefit? Charles raised his hand for silence, his kingly authority asserting itself despite the deeply personal nature of the conversation. The question now is what we do about this situation. Some items have already been moved. Some may have been given away or sold. The damage to the royal collection may be irreversible. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the gardens where he had walked that morning feeling only grief for his mother. Now that grief was compounded by betrayal, by the realization that while he had been mourning, someone he trusted had been systematically dismantling pieces of his family's legacy. I want everything returned, he said without turning around. Every single item on that inventory needs to be back in royal custody within the week. And I want a complete accounting of anything that may have been given away, sold, or otherwise disposed of. When he finally turned back to face the room, he saw that Camilla's expression had hardened into something approaching defiance. And if I refuse? Are you threatening me, Charles? The question crystallized everything that had been building in his mind since that morning's discovery. This wasn't just about missing jewelry or relocated artwork. This was about trust, about respect, about the fundamental values that held his family and his institution together. I'm not threatening you, Charles said quietly. I'm telling you what must happen if you want to remain part of this family and this institution. The choice is yours. The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, the sun had set completely, and the office was now lit only by the warm glow of desk lamps that created pools of light and shadow across their faces. Charles could see his siblings watching him carefully, understanding that this moment would define not just his marriage but his reign as king. Camilla stood slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. I see. So this is how it's going to be. After everything we've been through together, after all I've sacrificed for this family, you're willing to throw away our marriage over some old jewelry and photographs. Charles felt his heart breaking, but his resolve remained firm. This isn't about jewelry, Camilla. This is about honor. This is about respecting the institution we've both sworn to serve. And this is about the kind of example we set for future generations. As Camilla moved toward the door, she paused and looked back at him one final time. In her eyes, he saw not the woman he had fallen in love with, but someone he barely recognized, someone who saw royal heritage as a commodity to be exploited rather than a sacred trust to be preserved. You'll regret this decision, she said softly. When you're sitting alone in these empty rooms, surrounded by your precious objects and your pristine principles, you'll remember what you've given up. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving the three siblings alone with the weight of what had just transpired. Charles sank back into his chair, suddenly, feeling every one of his 75 years. The crown had never felt heavier, but he knew that the decision he had just made was the first truly royal decision of his reign. 2 weeks had passed since that confrontational evening in Charles's office, and the reverberations of that conversation had spread through every corner of the royal household like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. The ancient walls of Windsor Castle, which had witnessed centuries of royal drama, now held a new tension as staff members spoke in hushed tones and courtiers carefully navigated the increasingly strained atmosphere. Charles sat in his mother's former study, which had now been restored to its original state. Every item that had been packed away had been meticulously returned and placed exactly where Elizabeth had kept it. The Boucheron sapphires gleamed in their display case, the family photographs smiled from their silver frames, and the leather-bound books stood in perfect order on their shelves. Yet despite the physical restoration, the room felt different somehow, as if the very air held the memory of betrayal. The king's private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, entered with the morning briefings, his expression carefully neutral despite the extraordinary circumstances of recent weeks. Your Majesty, he began formally, I have updates on the situation we discussed. Charles looked up from the letter he had been writing, a personal note to his mother's lady-in-waiting, expressing gratitude for her years of devoted service and asking for her help in cataloging which items had been returned and which might still be missing. Please, proceed. The inventory recovery is nearly complete, Sir Clive reported. 93% of the listed items have been returned to royal custody. However, there are still some concerns about pieces that may have been distributed before our intervention. The phrase "our intervention" was diplomatic language for what had been, in reality, a series of increasingly tense negotiations. Camilla had initially refused to cooperate with the return of items, claiming legal ownership based on her position as queen consort. It had taken the involvement of the royal legal team and some very frank conversations about the potential consequences of continued non-compliance to secure her cooperation. What about the items that were photographed at the Parker Bowles estate last month? Charles asked, referring to pieces that had been spotted in publicity photos from a charity event at Tom Parker Bowles' country house. Those have been more challenging to address, Sir Clive admitted diplomatically. Some items were apparently given as gifts to other family members or friends before we became aware of the situation. Recovering those pieces may require legal action. Charles nodded grimly. The thought of pursuing legal action against his own stepchildren was deeply painful, but the principle at stake was larger than personal relationships. The royal collection represented centuries of history, and allowing its dispersal would set a precedent that could devastate the institutional heritage of the monarchy. A soft knock interrupted their conversation. Princess Anne entered, followed by Prince Edward and, to Charles's surprise, Prince William. The presence of his eldest son added weight to what Charles suspected would be a significant conversation. "Father," William said, his voice carrying the same formal tone that had characterized all their recent family discussions, "we need to discuss the public relations aspect of this situation." Charles had been dreading this conversation. While the family had managed to keep the details of Camilla's actions private so far, he knew that such secrets rarely stayed buried for long in the modern media environment. The question wasn't whether the story would become public, but when and how. "What have you learned?" Charles asked, gesturing for them to sit. William opened a folder he had been carrying. "Our communications team has been monitoring social media and press inquiries. There are rumors circulating, but nothing concrete has been published yet. However, we've received several inquiries from journalists who seem to have partial information about changes in the queen consort's status." The phrase "changes in status" was a euphemism for what had become an increasingly untenable situation. Camilla had not left Windsor Castle, but her role in royal functions had been quietly minimized. She no longer attended private family meetings, her public appearances had been reduced to the absolute minimum required by protocol, and her access to certain areas of the royal residences had been restricted. "The staff are talking," Anne added bluntly. "Despite all the confidentiality agreements and loyal service, word is getting out. We have perhaps a week, maybe two, before someone decides to go public with what they know." Edward leaned forward in his chair. "We need to make a decision about how to handle this. Do we get ahead of the story with our own announcement, or do we prepare to respond reactively when the press breaks it?" Charles felt the weight of kingship pressing down on him more heavily than ever. Every decision he made now would have consequences not just for his personal life, but for the institution of monarchy itself. The public's perception of royal behavior, their trust in the integrity of the system, and their support for the continuation of constitutional monarchy all hung in the balance. "What are our options?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. William consulted his notes. "The communications team has developed several potential approaches. The most straightforward would be to announce a mutual decision for the queen consort to step back from public duties for personal reasons. We could frame it as a desire to focus on private family matters. That's essentially admitting something is wrong without providing details," and pointed out. "It might satisfy public curiosity temporarily, but it would also fuel speculation. The alternative," William continued, "is to be more transparent about the situation. Acknowledge that there were disagreements about the management of the late Queen's estate, and that these disagreements led to changes in household arrangements." Charles considered both options, but neither felt adequate to the gravity of what had occurred. How could they explain to the public that the queen consort had systematically appropriated royal heritage for her own family without making the entire institution appear corrupt or incompetent? Sir Clive cleared his throat diplomatically. "Your Majesty, there is a third option that the legal team has been exploring. Given the nature of what occurred, there may be grounds for a formal separation that would remove the queen consort title while maintaining the marriage in a private capacity." The suggestion hung in the air like an unexploded bomb. Such an arrangement would be virtually unprecedented in modern royal history. It would acknowledge the severity of Camilla's actions while potentially limiting the damage to Charles's personal reputation and the monarchy as an institution. "You're talking about stripping her of the title," Charles said slowly, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "Not stripping, sir. Restructuring. The marriage would remain intact, but the official royal role would be suspended." Charles stood and walked to the window, looking out over the grounds where he had spent so much of his life preparing for this role. The irony wasn't lost on him that his first major decision as king involved the woman he had fought so hard to have accepted as his consort. "What does Camilla say about these options?" he asked. William and exchanged glances. "She's not speaking to any of us," and replied. "She's been staying in the guest wing and communicating only through her private secretary when absolutely necessary." The isolation that Camilla had imposed on herself reflected, Charles realized, the impossible position she had created. By claiming royal treasures for her family, she had violated the fundamental trust that made royal marriage possible. A royal consort wasn't just a spouse, they were a guardian of institutional heritage. By betraying that trust, she had made her continued role in royal life untenable. As the evening light began to fade, Charles made his decision. "Schedule a meeting with Camilla for tomorrow morning. I'll speak with her directly about the options available. But make it clear that the status quo cannot continue." The room remained silent as the implications of his words settled over them. Charles knew that tomorrow's conversation would likely end the most complicated and controversial love story in modern royal history. But, as king, his duty to the institution had to come before his personal desires. Looking around the study one final time before leaving for the evening, Charles felt his mother's presence more strongly than ever. Elizabeth had spent 70 years making difficult decisions that put duty before personal preference. Now, in his greatest test as king, Charles understood that he must follow her example, no matter the personal cost. The restoration of her study was complete, but the restoration of the royal family's integrity would require one final, painful decision. As he turned off the lights and closed the door behind him, Charles knew that tomorrow would mark either the end of his marriage or the beginning of a new and unprecedented chapter in royal history.